Welcome back to U.S. Government and Politics. My name is Jim Toot, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Central Virginia Community College. Imagine a society in which everyone was perfectly free to do as he or she pleased. How long would it take for chaos to set in? Order implies a necessary loss of freedom if people are to survive. However, how far can order go? Democratic countries cherish individual freedom and generally believe that laws should not be repressive. A little order can be sacrificed in the name of liberty, so one kind of balance is between order and liberty. In the late 18th century, the founders created the blueprints for the United States government in an effort to achieve these delicate balances between liberty and order, and between liberty and equality, at least for some Americans. Their successes for all is reflected in the continuing efforts to refine them. The formula has changed with time, but the framework provided by the Constitution and the values expressed by the Declaration of Independence remain the same. These words represent basic values of democratic political systems, including that of the United States. Rule by absolute monarchs and emperors has often brought peace and order, but at the cost of personal freedoms. Democratic values support the belief that an orderly society can exist in which freedom is preserved, but order and freedom must be balanced. Sea travel expanded the horizons of many European nations and created prosperity and the conditions for the Enlightenment. In turn, the Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and justice helped to create the conditions for the American Revolution and the subsequent Constitution. The American colonies began developing a democratic tradition during their earliest stages of development. Over 150 years later, the colonists believed their experience was great enough to refuse to recognize the British king. The first decade was rocky. The American Revolution and the domestic instability that followed prompted a call for a new type of government with a constitution to guarantee liberty. The Constitution was drafted in the early days of the independent American Republic and has endured longer than any in human history. Where did this democratic tradition truly begin? The ideas and practices that led to the development of the American Democratic Republic owe a debt to the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, the Protestant Reformation, and Gutenberg's printing press. But the Enlightenment of 17th century Europe had the most immediate impact on the framers of the United States Constitution. Europeans of the 17th century no longer lived in the darkness of the Middle Ages. Ocean voyages had put them in touch with many world civilizations, and trade had created a prosperous middle class. The Protestant Reformation encouraged freethinkers to question the practices of the Catholic Church, and the printing press spread the new ideas relatively quickly and easily. The time was ripe for the philosophers, scholars who promoted democracy and justice through discussions of individual liberty and equality. The ideas of the 17th and 18th century philosophers inspired the founders to revolt against what they perceived as unfair British taxation. Thomas Hobbes, an Englishman, concluded in his famous book Leviathan that people are incapable of ruling themselves, primarily because humans are naturally self-centered and quarrelsome and need the iron fist of a strong leader. No arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The U.S. Constitution has its roots in the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment in Europe, a movement that questioned the traditional authority of the monarch to rule. What gives one person the right to rule another? Enlightenment philosophers answered the question by acknowledging the importance of establishing order. They were influenced by the chaos of medieval times when a lack of centralized government brought widespread death and destruction. Voltaire's main contribution to the Enlightenment was freedom of speech, press, and religion, and an opposition to monarchy, militarism, and slavery. Voltaire was a crusader against tyranny and bigotry. Charles de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, was a researcher of French history and law, and in his book The Spirit of Laws, he presented his ideas on government. It is from Montesquieu that the founders of the United States received the idea of separation of powers into branches of government. In every government, there are three sorts of power: the legislative, the executive in respects to things dependent on the laws of nation, and the executive in regard to things that depend on civil law, or the judicial. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may answer lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws and execute them in a tyrannical manner. Again, there is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. If it were joined to the executive power, the judge would behave with all the violence of an oppressor. There would be an end of everything were the same man or the same body, whether of nobles or of the people, to exercise those three powers, that of enacting laws, that of executing the public resolutions, and that of judging the crimes or differences of individuals. According to some, Jean-Jacques Rousseau exercised minimal influence on the American founders like Thomas Jefferson, despite the similarities between their ideas, such as shared beliefs regarding the self-evidence of the claim that all men are created equal. Jefferson and Rousseau shared conviction that citizens of a republic be educated at public expense, and the evident parallel between the U.S. Constitution framers' concept of the general welfare and Rousseau's concept of the general will. And the parallel between Jeffersonian democracy and Rousseau's praise of Switzerland and Corsica's economies of isolated and self-sufficient independent homesteads, and his endorsement of a well-regulated citizen militia such as Switzerland's. John Locke was the English philosopher who theorized that government was the manifestation of a general will of the governed that allowed the governed to change their governors at will. His book, Treatises on Civil Government, was very influential in the American Revolution. According to Locke, a ruler gains authority through the consent of the governed. The duty of that government is to protect the natural rights of the people, which Locke believed to include life, liberty, and property. If the government should fail to protect these rights, its citizens would have the right to overthrow that government. This idea deeply influenced Thomas Jefferson as he drafted the Declaration of Independence. The Magna Carta, written in 1215, established the kernel of limited government, or the belief that the monarch's rule was not absolute. Although the document only forced King John to consult nobles before he made arbitrary decisions like passing taxes, the Magna Carta provided the basis for the later development of Parliament. Over the years, a government led by a prime minister came to control and eventually replaced the king as the real source of power in Britain. The Petition of Right extended the rights of commoners to have a voice in the government. The English Bill of Rights guaranteed free elections and the rights of citizens accused of crime. Although King George III still had some real power in 1776, Britain was already well along the path of democracy by that time. The foundations of American government lie squarely in the 17th and 18th century European Enlightenment. The American founders were well versed in the writings of the new philosophers whose ideas influenced the shaping of the new country. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, and others took the brave steps of creating a government based on the Enlightenment values of liberty, equality, and a new form of justice. More than 230 years later, that government is still intact.